So with that said, we're ready to talk about muscle fiber typing. So remember the other day we learned that muscle fiber is the fancy way to describe a muscle cell. Okay, and if you were to open up our various skeletal muscles throughout the body, you're going to find that some muscles are very different from one another. Okay, and it relates a lot to the muscle fibers themselves, and that they are not all alike in how they're built, their composition, and how they function. Okay, one of the main things that is different between these muscle fibers is their content of myoglobin, which we talked about myoglobin last week. Kind of describe it as kind of like a cousin to hemoglobin, in that it is a protein that's interacting with oxygen. In the case of myoglobin, it can bind and kind of hold on to oxygen so that that oxygen can be released in order to make ATP aerobically. Okay. Well, some muscle fibers have a bunch of it. Some of them don't have nearly as much. Okay. Those that have a high myoglobin content are going to be described as red muscle fibers. Okay. And these are the muscle fibers that will produce a muscle that appears darker, like in the case of, if you look at a chicken leg or chicken thighs, it produces that dark meat. Okay. Red muscle fibers are also going to contain more mitochondria, because that's where the aerobic respiration process takes place. Remember, aerobic respiration is kind of the fancy way to describe energy production. Not all energy production involves oxygen, and not all energy production takes place in the mitochondria. Okay, as we'll find out in a few weeks when we get into this in much greater detail. But aerobic respiration does take place in the mitochondria, and therefore there's going to be a lot of those organelles in your red muscle fibers. Red muscle fibers are also going to be supplied by more blood capillaries to deliver that oxygen and to remove the waste that those muscle fibers are producing. Okay. On the other end of the spectrum are the white muscle fibers, which have a much lower content of myoglobin, and therefore they are going to appear lighter. And this is where white meat comes from, like in chicken breasts, or if you think like, in turkeys are a good example. You like dark meats, and how people prefer those. Generally, when I teach this in the fall, it's right around Thanksgiving time, which is kind of a handy way to discuss that. But this is obviously not Thanksgiving time. So that's one way to classify muscle fibers. The other way, and it's a little bit more sophisticated, is based on several factors. Okay, and a lot of it is based on how fast or how slowly they contract, how they generate their ATP, whether that's aerobic or anaerobic, and how quickly they fatigue or get tired. So based on these structural and functional characteristics, we classify muscle fibers into three main types: type 1, type 2A, type 2X, which those three categories are kind of the traditional terms or the traditional descriptions. You'll see here in the next three slides that there's a more descriptive term for each of these. For example, type 1 can be described as slow oxidative fibers. My advice for you guys is to make sure you know them both as the type 1, type 2A, type 2X, and then their other kind of fancier term, which is what we'll see here in the next couple of slides. Because you'll probably see it both ways, especially if you go into higher level physiology type classes. So type 1 fibers can be described as slow oxidative, and that's because they are the slowest as far as contracting goes. Oxidative means that they make their ATP predominantly using oxygen. Now, oxidative doesn't technically mean using oxygen. That's what aerobic means, but that's kind of an easy just way to think of it. Oxidative, think oxygen. Okay, so they're slow, but they produce ATP aerobically. They're also, aside from being slow, pretty weak compared to the other three types, and that's because they're the smallest in diameter, and since they're the smallest, they're the least powerful. Okay, slow oxidative or type 1 fibers appear very dark as far as red colored, and that's because of the myoglobin that they have an abundance of. Okay, aside from that, they also have a lot of mitochondria, so they generate their ATP, once again, mainly by aerobic respiration. Already told you they are slow as far as contraction speed goes. Aside from that, though, a benefit that they have is that they're very resistant to fatigue. So they're less likely to get tired, which enables them to perform prolonged sustained contractions for many hours, which is good for certain types of muscles like your postural muscles, or in aerobic endurance type activities like running a marathon. And now, if you look at a person and you compare them to another person, we're all going to be different in the percentages of these free muscle fibers that we have. Okay, but people can be kind of predestined to have more or less of a certain type. For example, if you think of like high-level athletes, like I always describe like the Kenyan marathoners in the Olympics, because the Olympics is a good example of the highest level athletes in the world. There's typically a lot of athletes from Kenya that run the marathon, and that's probably because if you were to open up their leg muscles, you'd find that there's a lot of type 1 muscle fibers. Okay, does that mean that sprinters and non-distance type activity or distance athletes are going to have no type 1 fibers? Absolutely not. We have certain muscles in our body, especially like our postural ones that run up and down our spine, that are predominantly built with type 1 fibers so that they can continually contract on a kind of like long-term several hour type basis. So those are type 1 fibers, which you think are on one end of the spectrum. In the middle of the spectrum are the type 2A fibers, or the fast oxidative glycolytic. I'm actually going to go ahead and talk about the final category, and then I'll come back to the second slide there and talk now about type 2X fibers. Okay, I want to talk about fast glycolytic fibers, or type 2X fibers, now because they're on the opposite end of the spectrum as the type 1s. So you had type 1s, which were slow, fatigue resistant, very small, not very powerful. Type 2Xs are the exact opposite of that. Okay, they're fast, hence the name fast glycolytic. Glycolytic means that they use glycolysis as their primary means of making ATP. And glycolysis, we learned a little bit about that the other day, is a anaerobic process. That means it doesn't need as many mitochondria, because glycolysis does not take place in the mitochondria, it just takes place on the sarcoplasm. Okay, and that's an anaerobic process, so they don't need as much oxygen, so they don't need as much myoglobin, they don't need as much blood capillaries to supply them with that oxygen. Okay, they're going to appear white in color, and they're going to contract very strongly and very quickly. In fact, these are the most powerful, and that's because of the largest in diameter. Okay, your very powerful type athletes that can perform very intense anaerobic movements for short durations are going to have an abundant number of these. So like weightlifters, pitchers, like throwing a very fast ball, track sprinters already kind of mentioned. If you guys ever heard of like Usain Bolt, who was in the Olympics the last few times, running the 100, 200 meters, fastest man on earth. I think he's retired from doing the Olympics, so he won't be doing the next Summer Olympics. But he is probably the quintessential power athlete, and how fast his legs were able to contract and able to move, and he can almost fly down the track. It's amazing. He's going to have a very high, abundant number of these. If you think of like animal world, like cheetahs, for example, the fastest mammal on earth that can run at high speeds, can't do so for very long though, and that's because these fibers fatigue very quickly. Okay, for most people, like what we describe as like non-athletes, it's a pretty standard 50-50 split, roughly. Okay, where about half of their muscle fibers are going to be type 1, and then about half are going to be the 2A and 2Xs. Okay, but if you're a distance runner, you're going to have a lot of type 1s, not so many of the type 2s. Track sprinters are going to have very few type 1s and a lot more of the type 2s. Okay, type 2A are in the middle, as I've mentioned, between the type 1s and the type 2Xs. They share properties with both of them. So they're fast contracting, although they're not quite as fast as the Type 2Xs, oxidative and glycolytic, means that they make ATP aerobically and anaerobically. So they do need myoglobin and many blood capillaries to allow them to get oxygen and use that oxygen to make ATP aerobically, but they also can make their ATP anaerobically through glycolysis. Okay, they will appear dark red, having high or moderately high resistance to fatigue, but they're not quite as resistant to the fatigue as the type 1s. And they're going to perform contractions at a fairly high rate, not quite as fast as the type 2X is, but they're able to do activities as, different as walking and sprinting are. Okay. In other words, they can do like the slower type, less intense type activities like walking, and they can do the much more powerful, much more intense type of activities like sprinting. And so like I said, some people have a predisposition, their bodies are built in order to produce more, rapid type contractions. That's why, sprinters are able to sprint, but they're not necessarily able to run long distances as well. Can you train to change your fiber type? What do you guys think? Can you do different physical activities that might influence fiber typing? The answer is yes, absolutely. Okay. But keep in mind, that's pretty limited. You can't really truly change the makeup of your muscle to a high degree. And the truly only way to change your fiber type, and to, I always say it this way, if you want to be a high level athlete, pick your parents wisely. Obviously, we can't do that, right? So what am I saying? What do I mean when I say pick your parents wisely? It's all about what? Genetics. So genetics, that's your lottery ticket. If you want to be an Olympic athlete, you got to hit the lottery with your parents. And all right, thinking back to last time we met, talked a lot about the neuromuscular junction, the NMJ or neuromuscular synapse. And we learned about what happens there with the release of acetylcholine from the synaptic end bulb, which binds to receptors on the motor end plate, allowing sodium ions to come in. Okay. Well, with all those different things taking place at the neuromuscular junction, it's not surprising to find that there are chemicals and drugs that can influence or interfere with those actions. Okay. Botulism is a thing that we've talked about before. You can get botulism from improperly canned foods. So if you've ever seen the movie Big Daddy, there's a scene where they're throwing the cans down on the ground to dent them up because they're 50% off. Don't do that. Don't go to the store and get the 50% off dented cans, because you can get botulism. You've probably heard of Botox before. People inject that like into their face so that they can look young again. So what does this toxin do? Well, it blocks the release of acetylcholine from synaptic vesicles, which means that there will be no action potential created in the muscle fiber, which means that there will not be any muscular contraction. So botulism actually paralyzes the muscles, and that's not a big deal if you're doing it into your face, because those muscles just allow you to like smile and wink and that kind of stuff. Obviously not that big a deal. But if you were to get this type of toxin in your respiratory muscles, that'd be very deadly, because then you wouldn't be able to breathe. Okay. Curare is a plant poison used in South America by Indians with their arrows and blowgun darts. Kind of works in a similar way. It causes muscle paralysis, but this time it's because of not being able to, or not preventing the release of acetylcholine, but it's blocking the acceptance of acetylcholine by those receptors on the motor end plate. So if the acetylcholine can't bind to the receptors, sodium ion channels can't open up, therefore the muscle doesn't become excited and the muscle doesn't contract. Okay. Derivatives of curare are actually used in surgery to relax skeletal muscles. So that's a benefit to them, and is a wonderful thing that doctors utilize. Pesticides, or kind of the fancier term for that, is organopesticides. Common chemicals that farmers use to like protect their crops from grasshoppers and other insects that can really damage them. But a lot of pesticides bind irreversibly to acetylcholine esterase, which we learned a little bit about the other day. Is that enzyme that breaks down and degrades acetylcholine, removes it from the synaptic cleft, removes it from the receptors, and thus allows for muscle relaxation. So if there is no acetylcholine esterase, that acetylcholine is going to stay bound to those receptors, and thus the muscle still is excited and will continually contract, and that would basically prevent the muscle from relaxing. And that's essentially how a lot of nerve agents work. If you've ever heard of like chemical warfare, which is one of the scariest things to think about, a lot of nerve agents, a lot of chemicals that could be very deadly, kind of do the same thing. They bind to the acetylcholine esterase and activating it, causing uncontrollable action of the acetylcholine, so much so that the muscles just contract over and over and over again, which can end up leading to death in a very gruesome and unpleasant way. Myasthenia gravis is an autoimmune disease in which the body is going to produce antibodies against itself, against those receptors for acetylcholine on the muscle cell, which prevents normal interaction between acetylcholine and receptors. And so essentially, myasthenia gravis is kind of the body producing a response just like what Curare would do to you, where the acetylcholine and that relationship between those receptors is interfered with. So kind of a couple things there I chose out of the textbook there. The textbook goes into a few other examples of things at the neuromuscular junction, but I just kind of picked out a few of them, not all of them. All right, this next slide here, I'm actually going to just jump ahead, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to be stuff I'm going to cover on the exam. Muscles and joints as lever systems really is a physics-based discussion, and I feel like every time I try to teach it, it just seems to be information that is hard to explain and hard to grasp, and one slide is just not enough to really get an understanding of it. So I'm going to just jump ahead to our last slide here on exercise training and muscles. Something I'm obviously very enthused about is exercise and its effect on the body. I told you guys earlier this semester that my bachelor's and my master's degrees were in kinesiology, exercise science. So I have an appreciation for what happens to the body and in response to exercise. And I've talked a little bit about how like training can alter your muscle fiber typing. What does muscle actually do to your muscles? This is what I'm going to talk about here on this slide. No matter what, regardless of whether the training program is endurance based or is it resistance based, so whether you're lifting weights, whether you're going from long runs, whether you're doing interval training, okay, no matter what the training regimen is, when your body responds, it does so by producing a specific amount of proteins within the muscle fibers that therefore will allow for increased performance, okay? And it's all because that the stress of exercise stimulates cell signaling pathways and contracting muscle fibers that switch on transcriptional activators, which turn on specific genes to synthesize new proteins, okay, which is a really long-winded mumbo jumbo sentence, okay? But if I kind of describe it like this, let me see if I can do something real quick. I'm gonna do a whiteboard here. So if you think back to earlier in the semester, we talked about how we can take DNA, we can take it and make RNA, and then we can take that RNA and we can make proteins. Okay, we call this gene expression, right? Well, exercise turns on genes. Remember, genes are segments of DNA, okay? And what we do with that DNA is we make RNA, okay? Well, then we take that RNA and we make proteins. The process where we go from DNA to RNA is transcription. The process of going from RNA to proteins is translation, okay? Well, when we exercise, we turn on transcription. And that's evident here with this top graph showing you hours after exercise, the production of 3 different mRNA proteins have been measured. And you can see after about 6-7 hours of exercise, or after 7 hours after exercise, let me say it correctly, we have produced a significant amount of RNA, which then means that we're going to take that RNA and make proteins. And those specific proteins that are formed are going to determine the muscle's characteristics and its ability to perform the specific types of exercise. But is one single bout of exercise enough to do anything significant for us? No. Okay. If you've ever been a part of a team or participated in physical activity, you don't practice one day and then go compete the next. Okay? You got to train. Okay. So a single bout is insufficient enough to produce large changes in the proteins within a muscle fiber. But one exercise session promotes disturbances in cellular homeostasis that, when repeated over time, results in the specific exercise-induced adaptation associated with long-term training. And that's evident here with the bottom graph that shows like 12 weeks of training, we have produced a significant amount of these 3 proteins, and these proteins are therefore going to hopefully improve the performance of that specific muscle. So the take-home message states that exercise repeated on a daily basis has a cumulative effect, leading to a progressive increase in specific muscle proteins that overall improve muscle function. And that just reiterates what we've talked about since the very beginning of the semester, that, you know, something's getting done in the body, chances are a protein's doing it. Well, when muscles get built better by stressing them over and over again, they work better because they have more proteins, and those proteins produce that more efficient function. Now, thinking about exercise and training, whether once again we're talking high intensity interval training or we're talking long distance or short distance, whatever, are the only changes that occur to your body occurring within your skeletal muscle? In other words, if you're a runner, do you only see changes occurring at the muscle level, or do changes occur to other systems of the body? They absolutely do occur to other systems of the body. One of the most impacted systems of the body by exercise is the system we're getting ready to talk about. And that system is the cardiovascular system. And that's